Happy weekend, ladies and gentlemen. It's Miss Lowe, and these are your short story review notes. A lot of this should look very familiar to you since you've been reading short stories throughout grade school and middle school. So some of the terms will be new to you. Some will be familiar from freshman year. So go at your own speed through this PowerPoint. Follow your guide. They should be in order. Fill in all the information. If you want to stay on a slide longer, pause it. If you want to go ahead quicker, go ahead and move ahead. But other than that, we're going to go ahead and review this over the weekend so that when we come back to school on Monday, we can dive right into reading. What is a short story? Obviously, it is a concise work of fiction, concise meaning not as long as a novel, shorter than a novel. Again, these things, as long as you know them, if you don't feel it 100% necessary to write down that it's shorter than a novel, that is perfectly okay. It possesses the same literary elements as a novel, as a film, as all types of work. An author, David Sedaris, once said, "A good short story would take me out of myself and then stuff me back in, outsized now, and uneasy with the fit, because it's all compact, all of this information into one short, condensed, great story." So the elements of the short story that we're going to look at and study are plot. And these are the sequence of events in a story from beginning to end. All fictional writing, all fictional works have a plot. Plays, novels, movies, television shows. Some plots are obviously better than others. For example, Sharknado and Sharknado 2, two films that I've unfortunately watched, and not all of Sharknado 2, but that's besides the point. These all have a plot. They have conflict. They have beginnings and endings. They have characters. And this should look familiar to you. This is the narrative arc. Also known as the plot diagram. Some people call it a roller coaster, and it starts with the exposition, the rising action, conflict, climax, falling action, and the resolution. And we'll go through those more specifically. This you will receive later to draw in for your short stories. The exposition, obviously you know, is the beginning of a story. It's the basic thing that is happening. You get introduced to characters, and you get introduced to where the characters are from. And it also has, sometimes it'll possess a character's backstory, the setting, and then if anything has happened before, it will tell you that there are other things going on. This is where the authors tend to put a lot of the information that they don't necessarily need throughout the rest of the story, but that is important to know so that you understand your characters. For example, in the novel The Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen starts off right at the beginning of the novel, not telling us too much about the background, but we know something is different about this world than our own based on where she lives in District 12. We know that's different. We know the relationship with her sister right at the beginning. Conflict, the problems, it's the struggle between the forces going against the protagonist. There can be internal conflict and external conflict. You don't need to write those down because they are right after conflict. Internal conflict obviously takes place inside oneself. Someone is struggling with their own head, with their own mind. And this is called person versus self. When you have to make decisions, when you experience feelings of any kind, guilt, jealousy, and you're kind of battling internally with those feelings, conflict. Whereas external conflict has several, and it is a struggle outside of oneself, meaning external. So this is person versus person, which is the main character fighting with another person, or a character having tension with another person. Person versus nature, outside forces, disasters, people struggling with any type of entity outside of themselves. Person versus society, a little bit deeper. I would say that The Hunger Games is a good example of this. Katniss Everdeen versus the Capitol in District 12. So she's struggling with an idea, the political issue. Same with The Giver. You guys read that last year. Person versus technology, supernatural, fantastical. This would be a person versus a computer, would be an example of technology, person struggling with electricity. And so devices created by humans. The movie I, Robot would be an example of that. And then supernatural, fantastical, we're lumping these all into one category. So that's divine forces, gods and goddesses, paranormal, ghosts, spirits, things like that. Then there are complications. These are in the rising action, and these are the things that make the story progress. So they help us move toward the climax, all the things that could go wrong, all of the interactions that they have with. And that leads us into the rising action, which that lead to the climax. And the climax, of course, is the moment of highest emotional intensity. It's that nail-biting part of the story. You should be on the edge of your seat at this point. Also, the turning point where maybe a twist is revealed. And then, as you saw with the progression of the plot diagram, it is all created by conflict and complications. Falling action. Some stories don't have a falling action. Some stories will go right from a climax into the resolution, but the falling action, also the denouement, follows the climax, and it's the slowing of the story. Other events start to take place that are revealing the gradual end. The conflict begins its resolution at this point. It begins to get resolved. And then in a good story, they'll tie up loose ends. Even if it's a cliffhanger, they can tie things up. And then the resolution is the outcome. It is the ending of the story. All stories end. All stories have an ending. Some of them don't necessarily resolve, though. So a resolution is not always present. Like at the end of the movie Inception. I don't know if you've seen that, but there's a kind of ambiguous ending. It's not certain what's going to happen to the main character. So that would just be considered an ending and not necessarily a resolution. They want to leave you hanging and questioning and pulling your hair out. And like I said, story. Character. There are lots of different types of characters. They are the people, animals, or natural forces in a story. It doesn't have to necessarily be something living. And the types of characters, which you don't have to write down because they come after in your notes. Static, dynamic, round, flat, protagonist, or antagonist. And a lot of these should be very familiar to you. Static versus a dynamic character. A static character will always stay the same throughout. They don't change or learn from their mistakes. Whereas a dynamic character will change in some way, and they learn a lesson. So they show the moral of the story through the main characters usually. A good example of a static character in the Hunger Games would be someone like President Snow, because we don't know enough to know if he's changing, but we do know that he is this pretty static character. He stays pretty hard and angry and wants to bring people down. And then dynamic characters would be Katniss. We learn a lot about her. We learn that she softens, because she was very hard at the beginning too, and she softens toward Peeta. She changes in that way. And then round versus flat characters. A round character has a lot of detail about them. They are very developed by the author. They have personality. Your protagonists, your main characters, are going to be round characters most likely because we need to know about them. Flat characters don't have much development. They're usually the side characters. You don't know much about them because the author doesn't need you to know much about them. Protagonist, antagonist goes back to basic short story stuff. Main character versus the person who opposes the main character. And under protagonist, we say usually the good guy because you know that it doesn't always have to be a good guy. The protagonist doesn't have to always be good, such as if you're following bank robbers and they're the protagonists, and the cops would be the antagonists when technically the bank robber is bad and the cops are good. So that would be the reverse of that. And then in order to develop a character, an author needs characterization. And so that is how they give us that personality of the characters. That's what makes the story so engaging. If you don't have good characters, it's going to be difficult to get people to like the story. And then 2 types of characterization are direct and indirect, which are on your sheet, so you don't need to write those down. So direct characterization is when the author tells you exactly what the character is like. They don't drop subtle hints or anything. They come straight forward and tell you. The example from Harry Potter, Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. So we know where he works, we know what he looks like, and we get those physical characteristics. So that is direct characterization. Indirect characterization then is when they give us hints through dialogue, through interactions with the characters, or through an action, and that makes us kind of guess what the character is like. If another character is talking about our protagonist, we get to know that character better. So an example, at last, only the Weasley twins were left singing along to a very slow funeral march. Dumbledore conducted their last few lines with his wand, and when they had finished, he was one of those who clapped the loudest. So we learn a lot about Dumbledore here indirectly, showing his sense of humor, that he appreciates the Weasley twins, and then we learn about the Weasley twins, who are obviously very outgoing, very boisterous, and so they're the only ones that are left. Theme is very important, and we're going to hit on this a lot. It's different from plot, because plot is just what's going on in the story, and the theme is a little bit deeper than that. It is the main idea of the story, or the intention that the author had in making it. For example, I keep going back to the Hunger Games, but the Hunger Games theme, the author said that she was watching television, and she was watching like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and then she watched some Middle Eastern news station, or they were showing clips from the Middle East, and she said, how could these 2 things exist in the same world? And so that's how she created the Hunger Games, because we read that and we're like, how does District 12 exist? And then the Capitol is the way it is. So she's connecting to us, not necessarily saying this is our society and this is what we are like, but she's connecting to us by using these characters. And that's her theme, is that all places, all societies have some sort of corruption, some sort of negative thing going on. And the theme also is how you identify with it. How does it make you feel? So hopefully the short stories that we'll be reading will make you feel something one way or the other. And how can you relate, like I said. The setting, which we talked about earlier, part of the exposition, is the time and place of the action. It's where the story takes place. We can get detailed physical surroundings, obviously. In the Hunger Games, District 12 looks very different, or is described very differently from the Capitol. And so we get that physical description through Katniss's eyes. So that is part of the setting. And then we also get the mood, which is something that we're going to look at a lot this year, and how this set up to make you feel a certain way. And that is the atmosphere that is created by the author. It's how you get genres. It's how you get a horror genre versus a romantic novel versus a comedy. And that is the feeling that you should experience based on how the author chooses to use words. That is the mood. And the setting, the mood is created by the setting and where it takes place and how it feels at that certain moment. Stories are also written from a point of view. And it is the vantage point, the point from which the story is told. And we say not an opinion because it's not your point of view about the story. It's not how you feel about the story at this point. It is about who is telling the story. And so we have first person point of view, third person limited, third person omniscient, and second person. So again, you don't need to write those down because those will be coming up. So first person point of view is told from I. So Hunger Games is told from Katniss's point of view. the character tells it in their own words. Third person limited is the third person narrator, he or she, and you should be familiar with these terms, first person, third person, because you use them in your own writing. And this is when either an outside character or an outside narrator or someone in the story tells about the experiences of one of the characters. And it can be a character in the story, or it can be someone outside, but they only follow one person, and that's why they're limited, because then third person is the all-knowing. They can follow any character at any time. They can know their thoughts and feelings. The Game of Thrones series is written from a third-person omniscient because each chapter comes from a different person's perspective. Although I think Game of Thrones is actually written in first person from each chapter. So it's first person, but then we follow different ones. So maybe that's not a perfect example. And then third person omniscient is not usually a character in the story unless that character is an omniscient character. But it's hard for that to be a character in the story because they would have to be with every single person at every single time to know those things. And then second person is the you, the narrator that comes out and talks to you as the reader, which is very rare. And sometimes they can pop in and out of first person and second person, but this is where they let you know that the message is directed directly to you. It is not something that you will find in fictional writing a lot. I guess the Goosebumps books, Choose Your Own Adventure, were kind of like second-person narration. And it is not easy. So when we go to write our own short stories, writing in second person is probably not something that you should choose to do. Irony. Different types of irony is when there is a difference between appearance and what is real. So what you think is going to happen versus what actually happens. And we have situational irony, verbal irony, and dramatic irony. And these should be familiar from last year. They may not. And we'll go through these more specifically when we get to talking about irony in a story. I guess an example comes from an old song. An old man turned 98. He won the lottery and died the next day. That would be an example of situational. Verbal irony, then, is when there is a difference between what is said and what is meant, which I'm sure you guys know is all called sarcasm. So you say, "Oh, that's a real nice shirt you have on." But obviously what you're meaning is that is the most hideous shirt I've ever seen. Where you hear the Jaws music, dun, 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 and we know that great white shark is going to strike, but the person does not. And then foreshadowing are hints that the author gives you throughout the story. Sometimes if you have read a lot, if you read a lot of books, you pick up on these hints a lot better once you're more experienced with it. But foreshadowing gives hints of what is going to come later in the story. Foreshadowing helps build suspense because it allows you, especially if you are picking up on it, it gives you those little clues that help you reach that climactic moment. And then suspense is the tension that you feel. If you're excited, if you're nervous throughout a story, that is what suspense is. And that is all helped by the foreshadowing and the irony. And so these were your short story notes. I hope you enjoyed listening to this. Feels kind of weird actually doing this. I'm talking in my room all by myself. But I know that most of you are already familiar with all of this. So it's just a nice review. It's something that went much quicker for you at home than it would in the class. So we're going to try this out, see how you guys like doing notes like this. And then when you come to class, you should be prepared to discuss these short story terms as we look at some short stories together. So this has been fun. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. It was nice to meet all of you today or yesterday if you're doing it Saturday. Other than that, I will see you guys on Monday.